what are virtual machines and how do I deploy one?
A CPU is a neural net processor, a learning computer.
Okay, so virtual machines aren't some sort of Terminator sent from the future to eliminate John Connor. They're actually much simpler than that. I mean, imagine if you wanted to run 2 Windows PCs and 2 Linux PCs at the same time. Normally, each one would need its own physical chassis, CPU, memory, and hard drive space. That's a lot of clutter, right? But what if I told you there's a way to combine all 4 into a single box? All of these operating systems running simultaneously on one computer, sharing CPU, RAM, and hard drive space. This is what virtual machines allow you to do. They let you consolidate multiple computers onto one physical machine, saving you a lot of space, power, and potentially a lot of management headaches. So in today's video, we're going to dive into the world of virtual machines. We'll explore how they work, and I'll even help you deploy your very first one. And don't feel intimidated. The best way to learn is by doing.
I need to know how Skynet gets built. Who's responsible?
Okay, enough of the Terminator memes. Maybe. Let's get started. Now that we know what virtual machines are, let's dive a little bit deeper into how they actually work. And at the core of virtualization is something known as a hypervisor. The hypervisor is the abstraction layer that acts between our hardware and our virtual machines. You can think of the hypervisor as the sort of construct to the virtual environment.
This is the construct.
The hypervisor is simply just software, or in some cases a firmware, that allow us to allocate our physical resources to our virtual machines. It also acts as our single pane of glass for management. Now, there are 2 types of hypervisors available to us. The first one I'll cover is a Type 2 hypervisor. That's what we're going to use to actually deploy our first virtual machine. Type 2 hypervisors are super easy to use and super fast to get up and going because it's just a piece of software that runs on our already existing operating system, or OS for short. So, for example, I'm using a Windows PC, and we're going to be downloading Oracle's VirtualBox, an application that runs on top of my existing OS. Once we download VirtualBox and install it, we're going to use it to go ahead and deploy a Linux machine, our very first VM, and bonus Jonas, we're actually going to deploy a Windows machine as well. A Type 1 hypervisor is more commonly referred to as a bare metal hypervisor. And that's because it runs directly on top of the hardware without an underlying operating system such as Windows. So not only does that free up resources by not having an underlying OS, that also makes it more efficient because we can now talk directly to the hardware as opposed to talking through another operating system. Now, they can be a little bit more complicated to get set up, but not by much. You've probably heard of some examples of Type 1 hypervisors, such as VMware's ESXi or Hyper-V. Very creative with the name, Microsoft. Some examples of Type 2 hypervisors, which again we're going to be using today, are Oracle's VirtualBox or VMware's Workstation. So you can see how important it is to understand the role of the hypervisor in virtualization. It really is one of the most important parts of the system. All right, now enough talking. Let's get in and create our first virtual machine. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is go download all the files we need. We're going to need the Ubuntu ISO, the Windows ISO, and our hypervisor, VirtualBox. So go to your favorite search engine and simply search Ubuntu ISO. And you'll see the very first selection is Ubuntu Desktop. We're going to want that so that it comes with a GUI. And right here is the version we're going to need, so go ahead and download that. Next, let's go ahead and download the Windows 11 ISO. You can see that Windows offers us a couple different versions of the installer depending on how we're going to do it. If you scroll down, you'll see Download Windows 11 Disk Image. That's the one we're going to use. Select Download, Windows 11, Download Now. It's going to ask for a little bit more information from us, and Download. Now our last stop is going to be to get our hypervisor, VirtualBox. You can see right on the home screen, it's going to give us the option to download VirtualBox 7.0. Let's go ahead and click there. Now, the great thing about VirtualBox is that it's open source, so we don't need a license key and there's no subscriptions to have to worry about. It's completely free. Pretty cool, right? Nice. I'm running on Windows, so I'm going to click Windows Host. Now, VirtualBox does have some pretty awesome documentation, so I recommend you get into documentation, try some other things that we're not going to try in this video. Okay, so now that all our files are downloaded, let's go ahead and install VirtualBox. We'll go ahead and walk through the installation wizard. I'm going to go ahead and use all the defaults. And next, let's fire this bad boy up. All right, congratulations, you just installed your first hypervisor. Pretty easy, right? Let's go ahead and explore a little bit. So you'll see right off the bat, we have some tools at our disposal. We also can see our virtual network. Now, one thing we didn't talk about in the beginning was another big part of virtualization is the virtual network. When you create all these virtual machines, they have to have a way to talk. And since your hardware typically only has 1 or 2 NICs, you're going to need to virtualize those network interfaces. And that's where your virtual network comes into handy. Now, by default, VirtualBox is automatically going to create a virtual network for our machines, and they're going to be able to talk to the internet. You don't have to do anything. But if you want your virtual machines to talk to one another as if they're on the same network, we need to create our own virtual network. So let's do that now. We're going to navigate to NAT Networks and click Create. And you can see it's going to give us a default name, IPv4 prefix, and a DHCP server. So our virtual machines are automatically going to get an IP address. Let's go ahead and go down below and rename it. You can also assign it a different range if you'd like. I'm going to keep the default, and you can enable or disable the DHCP option. Then let's go ahead and click Apply. And there we go. Now we have our virtual network and our DHCP server so that when we create our virtual machines, they'll automatically get an IP address, they can talk to the internet via NAT, and they can talk to each other on the same virtual network. All right, now let's create our first virtual machine. We're going to go to the top and click Machine, New, and it's going to ask us to name our machine. It'll then give us a folder where it's going to put the virtual machine files, and then we're going to select the ISO image. You'll see I have mine here in Recent, but if we go to Other, we can view in our Downloads folder. I'm going to select Ubuntu Desktop. Now you'll see in the grayed out area, from the ISO, it actually detected that it's a Linux machine and that we're using the Ubuntu distro. Let's go ahead and click Next. And here's where we can specify the username and password that it's going to give the machine. Let's create that now. Now it's going to give us some additional options. Now, since this is Linux, we don't need a product key. You can give it a host name and you can give it a domain name. These are default values and I'm going to go ahead and stick with those. You do want to go ahead and include guest additions. This is going to give us some additional tools within virtualization that are handy to have. So we'll click Guest Additions and click Next. Now this is going to be where we specify how much physical hardware we actually want to give this virtual machine. Now from the ISO, it's going to recommend some defaults, but you can increase or decrease these based on how much resources you want to use. You can see it's recommending 2 gigs of RAM and 1 CPU. Since I have 12 available, I'm going to give it 1 more. We can then click Next, and then we're going to specify how much hard drive space we want to give it. You can see the default is 25 gigs. I don't see a reason to give it that much more right now, since this is just for demo purposes. I'm going to leave that as is. So let's click Next, and then it's going to give us the machine summary. Here we have a chance to review all the parameters we just gave it. I'm going to go ahead and click Finish. It's now deploying your virtual machine, and this is our virtual machine now starting up. We'll let it go ahead and just run through the default. Now we are going to get an error here, so don't get nervous. We just got to make a setting after the VM has been deployed. So you can see we have an error, but we're going to go ahead and fix that. Go ahead and click Close, and it's going to ask you if you want to save the machine state, send the shutdown signal, or simply power off the machine. Let's click Power Off the Machine, and it'll close out of our virtual machine. Now what we want to do is go into this machine settings. So let's highlight it and click Settings. And here we can change additional settings about the machine that weren't available to us in the initial deployment. So you can see our general settings. We have our name, our type and version. We have our system settings. This is where we allocated our memory and CPU, as well as our boot order. But if we go down to the display tab, what we're looking for is the graphics controller. You can see it's using VMS VGA. It doesn't really like that. And the recommended graphics controller is VBox SVGA for this Linux distro. So let's select that and click OK. Now let's go ahead and try to start this bad boy up again. We're going to go to the top and click Start. And this will launch our virtual machine window again. Ah, there we go. Now we can see it actually working. It's starting to power up the machine. And if you've deployed Linux before, this screen may look really familiar. While this is powering up, you can see every time we're working with a virtual machine, it slides out this notification center. This kind of lets you know things that are happening in the background. And boom, there we go. You can see that it's now preparing the machine. Congratulations, you just deployed your very first virtual machine on your very first hypervisor. All right, so now we can run through the installation wizard for Ubuntu. We'll select English, accessibility options, English again, use wired connection since we have a virtual network, and we'll just click try for right now. And there we go. We now have our first virtual machine. Let's go out to the internet and check the internet connection. So if I navigate up to Firefox, yeah, we know that you like keeping us safe.
My mission is to protect you.
I don't need to know that. Let's go ahead and just skip through these prompts. All right, let's try going out to YouTube and see what happens. And boom, we've got internet connection. Shout out Network Chuck. So next, let's just navigate up to our network settings here. And we're gonna take a look at our wired settings. And there's our virtual network. You can see that the DHCP server is giving me a 10.0.2.15. Go ahead and close out of your network settings. And for now, we're gonna power this down while we create our other virtual machine. Okay, so now let's create our Windows machine. So if we go up to Machine, New, let's go ahead and give it a name. We'll select the folder where we want the VM files, and then let's go out to our ISO image, Windows 11, open. You can see from the ISO, it's automatically detected that this is a Windows 11 image. Now, one thing we're going to do different here is we're going to click Skip Unattended Installation. An unattended installation allows us to set all of the different parameters, such as the username, password, and product key. That's then fed to the virtual machine and created automatically with all those parameters. With our Windows machine, I'm not going to use a product key since this is just for a demo. And if I do the unattended installation, it's going to throw some errors. So we're going to click Skip Unattended Installation and click Next. We're going to go ahead and assign it our resources, and this time you can see it's recommending 4 gigs of RAM and 2 CPU. I'm okay with that, so I'm going to click Next. Now it's going to recommend our hard drive space of 80 gigs. I'm okay with that, so I'm going to click Next. And again, it's going to give us our machine summary where we can check everything and change anything if we need to. This all looks good to me, so let's go ahead and deploy it. I'm going to click Finish. And this time, since it's not an unattended installation, the machine didn't automatically start up. So let's go ahead and go to the top and click Start. And you can see our machine is now starting up. Let's go ahead and minimize the notifications and maximize the window. Press any key. Okay, and this probably looks familiar. This is the Windows installation wizard. Let's go ahead and run through that. And here you can see since we didn't specify the license key in the unattended installation, it's going to ask for it now. Now, again, since it's just a lab, I'm going to click I don't have a product key. I'm going to select Windows 11 Home and click Next. I'll go ahead and accept the license agreement. Has anyone ever declined the license agreement here?
No! No!
So I'll click I accept and click Next. Now we're not going to do an upgrade because we don't have a current Windows installation. So let's click Custom. It'll ask what hard drive we want to use. And if you remember when we were setting up the virtual machine parameters, we allocated 80 gigs of hard drive space. So let's go ahead and use that one and click Next. Now it's going to run through its installation. So go ahead and go play PS5 for a little bit and come back. While Windows is installing, I want to mention that VirtualBox has a service called VBox Manage. This allows you to use your command line interface to deploy and manage virtual machines. So if you found yourself wondering, well, Josh, why do we have to deploy these machines and get errors and then change the settings later? Why can't we just do that right off the bat? Well, some settings aren't available to us through the GUI. And so this is where you can use the command line interface to get access to all of the parameters and allow you to do scripting so you could even deploy multiple virtual machines at once. All right, let's check back in on our Windows machine. All right, so my Windows machine finally came up for me. I will mention it took quite a while. The reason being is that I'm running OBS, I'm running Premiere Pro, I'm running Chrome, I'm running a bunch of things on my current Windows computer. And so if you remember, because we're using a Type 2 hypervisor, VirtualBox is having to share those resources with my Windows machine. This, plus I was running the Linux virtual machine, it bogged things down a little bit. And so I had to close out of some applications to speed things up. Just something to keep in mind when you're deploying your virtual machines. You're still limited on the hardware that's shared between all the different machines. And so if you do plan on practicing a little more with virtualization, I highly recommend going out to eBay and purchase yourself a used server or used laptop that you can really just dedicate to virtualization. All right, well now that we're booted up, let's go ahead and walk through the installation wizard. United States, yes. Keyboard, US. I don't need a second keyboard layout. It wouldn't be Windows if it didn't check for updates, right? Good things are coming our way. And another restart. All right, so now it wants a name for my device. I'm gonna go ahead and skip for now. And now it's gonna want you to sign in. And with Windows 11, it's really gonna want you to use a Microsoft account. So let's click sign in. Now, if you have a Microsoft account, go ahead and use that here. I'm gonna do a little bit of a workaround so that I can just use a local account. So if we go ahead and provide no at thankyou.com and click next, and go ahead and put in any password you want, it'll let us know that it was unsuccessful, and now we can create a local account. I'm gonna go ahead and unselect all the privacy options. I don't really wanna help collect diagnostic data, or I don't need any help with inking or typing. This is simply just a demo. All right, now it looks like our machine is finally ready. Let's let it boot up. All right, we finally have our Windows desktop. That was pretty quick, right? Let's go ahead and do another internet connection test. And there we go. We have internet on our Windows machine as well. Let's check out its network settings. I'm gonna go to the command prompt and simply type ipconfig. Uh-oh, you can see I've made a mistake. I actually have the same IP address on this machine that I do on my Linux machine. You can see that the DHCP server is giving me 10.0.2.15. Why did it do that? Well, when we deployed the machine, we actually forgot to give it our virtual network that we created. Let's go back and do that now. Let's go ahead and close out of the command prompt. And I'm gonna go ahead and just shut off this machine. Power off the machine. Okay. Now let's highlight our machine and go back into settings. And let's go down to network this time. Now you'll see that adapter 1 is set to NAT. That's the default that VirtualBox assigns it. That allows it to get out to the internet, but it doesn't allow it to communicate with other virtual machines on the virtual network. So let's change that. Let's go ahead and click the drop down from NAT, and we're gonna select NAT network. And now you'll see the virtual network that we created earlier. Let's go ahead and select it and click OK. Now we also wanna do the same thing for our Ubuntu machine. Let's go ahead and click it and click settings. And let's go down to network. And let's change that from NAT to NAT network and click OK. All right, so now that we have the proper virtual network selected, let's try powering these up again and communicating with each other. So we'll click Ubuntu and start. It'll go ahead and power up our machine. Now let's go back into VirtualBox and let's power on our Windows machine. All right, so let's go ahead and split screen these so that we can see both. Minimize our notifications. And now let's take a look at our network settings. So if we go to Network, Wired Settings, now let's log into our Windows machine, and let's go to our command prompt again, and we'll do ipconfig. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. We no longer have the same IP address. So you can see on our Linux box, we have a 10.0.2.15, and on our Windows machine, we have a 10.0.2.4. Let's see if they can communicate with each other. So now I'm gonna do a simple ping from the Windows machine to the Linux machine. We'll go ahead and do ping 10.0.2.15 and enter. All right, you can see that we're getting replies from the machine. They're now able to talk to each other and talk out to the internet. Awesome. So from here, feel free to deploy more virtual machines. Maybe you want to deploy another Windows one or a different Linux distro. Go ahead. Just remember that you're limited by the resources on your physical machine. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and close out of mine and actually delete them from the hypervisor. Let's do that now. Let's go ahead and click close and power off the machine. And let's click close. And before we power off this machine, I want to point out a couple options to you here. You'll see that we can save the machine state, we can send the shutdown signal, or we can power off the machine. Each time we've been powering off the machine, that's powering it off at the hypervisor level. We can send the shutdown signal. That would emulate if we were actually shutting it down from the guest OS. And then we can save the machine state. So you can actually take a snapshot in time of everything on that VM. That becomes super handy for backup purposes. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and just power it off. Okay, now that both machines are powered off, I'm gonna go ahead and right click, and you'll see additional options here. And since it's powered off, I now have the ability to remove it. It's gonna ask me if I really wanna remove it, and do I wanna delete all the files included with it. And if you remember, when we created the VM, we actually specified a folder where those files would live. So when we click delete files, it's actually removing all those files within that directory. Let's click delete all files, and there we go. We've deleted that virtual machine. Let's go ahead and right click our other one, go down to remove, and delete all files. And now we're back to our empty hypervisor, where you can deploy more virtual machines or create additional virtual networks and really use it as your own sandbox. I'm actually glad that we ran into issues with the virtual network. It gave you the ability to see how easy it is to simply turn off a virtual machine, change some settings, and then turn it back on. Now that you know what a virtual machine is, how it works, and even deployed a couple, I recommend going through VirtualBox's documentation and trying other things. Try using their CLI, or maybe even try a different hypervisor. Get yourself a used server or laptop and deploy a Type 1 hypervisor, like VMware's ESXi. Maybe that's a good idea for the next video. Well, thank you for joining me, and I hope this was helpful to you. Just don't go off and create your own Skynet. We know how that ends up. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.